I think it's about time we had another coffee break ramble. And I've seen a lot of stuff on the Tinterweb at the moment about not using a light meter and how you either eyeball it or use a grey card. Now there is some validity in using a grey card. Why is that? Well, very simply, what the meter in your camera and the processor in the camera is trying to do is determine 18% grey. Some people will argue and say it's 12% grey, but I guess you'd only really know that if you were designing the cameras. Where does 18% grey come from? If you understand that, you understand a lot of how some of the automatic functionality works on exposure and how you can adjust it. 18% grey comes from when they were first thinking about putting meters in cameras. And what Eastman Kodak did was they took a random selection of pictures. So they took pictures shot under different conditions, different locations, different equipment, different skill set of photographer, I guess. And what they did was they chopped them up into inch squares and measured them with a densonometer. And then they divided the number of what the measurement came out to by the number of measurements. And the answer was 18%. So what they determined was that the average photographer taking images of the average subject with average equipment under average breaking these teeth in for the dog, sorry, under average lighting conditions, 18% would get you into the ballpark. It was never a definitive, this is how it should be measurement. And that's why we have things today like exposure compensation, because it gives us what the camera initially thinks it should be. And then we have the right, as the creative, to lighten or darken that picture. So using a grey card makes a ton of sense because you can put it in the position of the subject, it's under the lighting conditions that you're shooting in, and as long as you completely frame your viewfinder with the grey card with nothing else in it, so no fingers holding the edge of it, just the grey card, under that lighting condition in your exposure lock, then it doesn't matter what's behind the grey card, you're going to get a great picture. So why do I still prefer to use a meter? Well, one of the big things you need to understand is how we perceive colour. Colour comes from light hitting a subject, absorbing certain wavelengths of light and bouncing others back. That's how we perceive colour. I mean, I'm wearing a black top, A, because it's slimming, maybe not working as well as I'd like it to, but what it's doing to the light that's falling on me is it's absorbing the vast majority of it and not reflecting it back. That's why we see it as being black, where in essence, my coffee cup, which it's got a little bit of coffee spilt on it, is predominantly white because what that's doing isn't absorbing any wavelengths of light at all, it's just reflecting them back. So we see blue, for example, because it absorbs the object, whatever it is that is blue, absorbs the vast majority of all of the spectral wavelengths and just reflects back the blue. Now, the meters that I always suggest, let's put the coffee cup down, the meters that I always suggest we use are incident light meters. Now, the meter in your camera is reflected, a reflected light meter, because it's measuring the light that's reflected off the subject. So that's why the grey card makes sense, because it's measuring the light that is falling on the subject and is reflected back. But by measuring the grey card, you're sort of converting the light into the language that the camera's meter and processor understands. Now, I much prefer to use an incident meter. So what does that mean? An incident meter measures the light that falls on the subject before it's reflected back. So in other words, the colour, the subject hasn't absorbed anything. So there's no trickery in what the camera sees. It's measuring the pure light falling on the subject. Therefore, irrespective of the colour of the subject, the meter reading has to be true and correct. Because we've all had situations, I'm sure, where maybe it snowed and we've gone out for a walk and we've taken our little dog with us that's a white West Highland Terrier, and we've thought, oh, let's take a picture of the dog in the snow. And we look and compose, and then the camera says to itself, oh my word, it's far too white, it's far too bright, I'm looking for 18% grey, I'll darken it down. And that's why we get dingy grey pictures of high contrast, or rather high key subjects in high key locations, because the camera doesn't see it through our eyes as the creative saying, oh, doesn't the dog look ace in the snow? It sees something that's too bright that it wants to bring back down to 18% grey, hence why we get those dingy pictures. And if we don't know that and don't tell the camera, whoa, hang on a minute, we're looking at snow and our white Scotty dog, therefore we want it to be white and we therefore have to brighten the exposure up, we end up with that dodgy sort of dark image. Just like if our beautiful black cat was in the cellar with us and we tried to take a picture again without controlling the camera sees black cat, black surrounding, and goes, oh no, it's too dark, I'm looking for 18% grey, I'll lighten it all up. And then we get an insipid cat in an insipid background that bizarrely looks a bit wishy-washy and grey, just as the white scene looks a bit dark and grey, because it's looking for 18% grey. And without us saying, no, hang on a minute, don't have a mad vapour, it's meant to be dark, it's meant to be black. One of the biggest challenges when I thought I was a good photographer years and years ago, before I actually maybe became a good photographer, the shop I used to go into to buy me equipment, which I don't think's with us anymore, a place called Camera in Cottam Street in St Helens. The guy behind the counter, Harry, said to me, listen mate, you'll be a good photographer when you can do a still life of a piece of coal, a lump of coal, and a slice of white bread, and get texture and clarity in both of those objects. And back then I didn't really quite understand what he was saying. I'd have been, 16, 17 years old. But as I developed as a photographer, I understood that the built-in meter is looking for this 18% grey. And without us judiciously reminding it that this is what we're looking for as the creative and controlling the exposure, then we get what we get, and it's not necessarily always what we want. And that's why an incident meter is the right professional tool to use, because we're not having anything affected in the reflectance, because we're measuring it empirically of what falls onto the subject. And for me, if I'm using multiple light setups, it's much easier to use this and measure each light at a time and determine its output. So I determine its ratio and I determine what I want the picture to be. I mean, having said that, it just sounds as though it's all about me. And do you know what? For my photography, it should be. And for your photography, it should be all about you. You should be making the decisions. You should be driving the machine. You shouldn't be allowing it to drive you, because it doesn't even understand what it's looking at, because it breaks its world down to 18% grey. So you need to add that little bit of intellectual creativity and guide the fabulous mechanics that we have in our cameras of today into creating the image that we want to create in front of us. Remember, the camera doesn't know what it's looking at. It just breaks its world down into 18% grey. And if you're only going to ever use a single light source and you're not using flash, then knock yourself out, use a grey card. But as soon as you're looking at multiple lighting setups and flash, then I'm afraid the incident meter is the thing that we need, because the meter in our camera doesn't meter independent monoblock flash at all. It will meter speed lights, etc. And again, it's looking for 18% grey, so it tends to try and be fooled relatively easily, and we have to use flash exposure compensation. But the truth of the matter is, for my money and for my experience, your meter is the invaluable tool for photographers. It's a bit like, well, to me at any rate, not using a meter is a bit like an electrician not using a phase detection screwdriver and just going, yep, it's live. It's the right tool for the job, and it's always, over the whole of my career, been the thing that's saved my bacon, got me out of trouble, and allowed me to produce better images in camera. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't post-produce. Of course we do. Everything needs post-production, but I'd rather get 80% in the camera and do 20% on the computer rather than the other way around. Because if I've got to sit on the computer, I'd rather be playing a video game, to be perfectly honest. So that's my take on grey cards. They are a useful tool, but to me, not as useful as your meter. So for me, meters win hands down every time over grey cards, and certainly over eyeballing it, because in my world I'm being paid to produce a definitive result. You know, if we're shooting a fashion line, or we're shooting beauty images or business headshots, we have to get it right as the way the client wants it to be. So by metering, measuring, and taking things by the numbers, we get the results that we need quicker, which pleases the client, and we get more work. And as a pro photographer, that's what it's about. It's about being paid for the job and us getting the best return on investment of our time, effort and energy. So meters all the way, trust me.